you very much. I'm very excited to introduce Professor Susan Harris-Rimmer. She teaches at the Griffith Law School, focusing on international human rights law, and also has now been selected to do the review in Queensland. She works on climate change, gender equality, and is a member of the Law Future Center. Sue leads the Griffith Climate Action Beacons Climate Justice theme. She's also the founder of the Every Gen Coalition, which is where I was lucky enough to meet her. She seeks to amplify the voices of current and future generations and highlight the long-term impacts of today's policy decisions. And with Professor Sarah Davies, Susan is the co-convener of the Griffith Gender Equality Research Network. And as I mentioned, I'm lucky to work with Sue at Every Gen and also as part of the Intergenerational Fairness Coalition. She's just an amazing person, and we're really happy to have her. So, Sue, I will turn it over to you to discuss how the budget looks from a baby born on budget day. Thanks.
Thank you so much. That's very generous. Welcome. I'm speaking from Meanjin, Brisbane, which is Turrbal and Jagera country. And I'm actually speaking to you live from the Community Legal Centre Queensland conference. So I am in a foyer, sorry about that, but it's nice and quiet at the moment. So I'm just so excited to tell you a little bit about the sort of intellectual exercises we've been doing around the federal budget, because as you know, the budget is such an important moment of choice for governments. It's where you often see their values actually laid bare in a very stark way. The choices and priorities of the government of the day are revealed by its budget measures generally. So we're quite interested in seeing politics done differently, policy making done differently, and we're quite inspired by the Welsh Future Generations, Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which imposes a duty on all public entities to consider the rights of future generations in a meaningful way. And what it has done is actually, apart from the legal duty, it's also affected their budgetary cycle. So they have done a couple of things around their budgetary cycle that are new and I think really exciting. The first is they're much more interested in holistic budget measures that follow strategy. So if you think about Australia's new gender equality strategy, Working for Women, you should be able to follow that strategy through legislation, policy and budget measures very clearly. They should all be coherent and lined up, and you as a member of the public should be able to trace whether we're on track to meet that strategy, right? Those long-term strategies. There's another one about domestic violence. There's another one around homelessness. There's closing the gap. There's a nature plan. There's a couple of very long-term strategies. There's of course also AUKUS, which we'll get into a bit, which is a very long-term strategy around Australia's defence thinking. So Australia does have some long-term thinking around particular measures, but at the moment that's not reflected in budget cycles. The budget cycles are a year's worth of spending with an extra 3 years in forward estimates. So you get a 4-year picture at best, and it's pretty partial. So the Welsh model has allowed us to think a little bit more longer term around what a budget cycle should look like. They have something like our Equity and Inclusion Committee that makes recommendations specifically for future generations. And they have particular markings around what money is for prevention of future crises. So we decided, all right, well, we'll be inspired by the Welsh model and we'll start applying a lens on our own federal budget and see what we can come up with. So basically, what's in this budget for a baby born on budget night as a proxy for future generations? Now, the methodology was the hardest part. So we used the 5 trends that have been modelled by Treasury in the intergenerational report, the 2023 intergenerational report that takes a 10-year horizon. And we use the Measuring What Matters Wellbeing framework as our guide to the correct direction of policies and budgetary measures. So in Wales, they use the Wales We Want framework. So they had a long-term framework that came up with the Wales We Want, which has 7 priorities. They're roughly similar to the Measuring What Matters Wellbeing framework. But of course, we didn't have a deep national consultation around those as we would have liked. But there's still time and there's still hope that we might have that type of conversation. We also don't have a national human rights framework at the moment, which would have also been the way we could have framed the budget methodology. So I'm more a human rights lawyer. I'm totally on board with wellbeing as a framework, but I use rights language. That's what I'm comfortable with, which is a slightly lower standard. It's a minimum standard of wellbeing and dignity. Wellbeing is a slightly higher standard. So I want to aim for wellbeing, but I'm down the bottom with minimum standards of human dignity at the moment. But they're close. They're closely matched. All right, so that's how we did it. We looked at okay, how does this particular budget measure, portfolio measure, how does it track against the intergenerational report trends, and how does it is it in the right direction for the Measuring What Matters framework? And then the Welsh budgetary model also asked a couple of questions, which is basically, does this measure target any particular demographic and leave them worse off? Does it restrict the choices of future generations to take any particular option? So you can see, if we'd had that conversation 20 years ago around national housing stock, we would be in a very different situation today. If we'd had that conversation 20 years ago about mental health practitioners, we would be in a very different conversation today. And we are currently in a conversation around defence spending, which is probably the biggest conversation we'll ever have in terms of budgetary measures. So, so I chose defence spending because I'm a defence wonk anyway, and most of defence spending is hidden in a budget, so it was a lot easier because you don't get all the details of defence spending because you wouldn't want a foreign power learning all our tricks. So a lot of the defence spending in the budget's actually quite hidden. You just get kind of overall headlines, and you get a proportion of GDP. Now, America has demanded that its allies meet a certain level of GDP to show that they're a good ally. So that's what we aim for. We're aiming for 2% of GDP, which is massive. It's a huge amount, and absolutely dwarfs our spending on diplomacy and aid and all sorts of other things in its international policy toolkit. So I looked at defence, for example. So if you take a future generations lens to defence, the question is, we have risked everything on the assumption that China is the biggest threat that we will face. And so we are essentially changing our defence capability so that we can project force in our region, which means a huge spend on particular types of missiles, on particular types of what they call amphibious capability. So they mean big aircraft carriers, things that could actually land a battalion on a foreign shore, that sort of stuff, which we've never had before. We've always been expeditionary. So they're making huge decisions. That was all under the Defence Strategic Review decision just recently, which makes it very clear that that basically China's behaviour constitutes the biggest threat to Australian national security. What if we are wrong is the question. What if we are wrong about that, and actually we never are invaded by China, or we never face hostile action by China in our region? That is a risk. It's a calculated risk, but it is a risk. So the question is then, what were the other things to use that money for? Because you can't actually use defence spending on many other things. There are certain defence spending you can spend on dealing with humanitarian emergencies, for example. There's a lot of capabilities you can use for disaster response, but there's a lot you can't. There's a lot of destructive capability that is not useful in any other context. So the question becomes, for our budget analysis, what if that money should have been spent on climate adaptation, for example, or disaster response, or disaster risk reduction? What is the trade-off? Or could it have been spent on defence, but thinking about defence in a broader way, which included the capacity to help the region around disaster preparedness and disaster risk reduction? So we're making choices all the time, and doing a future generations analysis probably allows us to pinpoint that a little bit more and to be less immersed in current ideological divides. So that's one example. So I put a link in the chat to the intergenerational budget analysis that we did. Another one that was fascinating was housing. So there's quite a lot in the budget statement around housing. And Aaron, so you'd think there'd be a happy baby. So we spend a lot of our time choosing graphics for a happy baby and a sad baby. The baby is sad about defence funding. Not because we won't know, we'll only know in retrospect whether the assumption that we've made is right or wrong. Because there's huge risks in not investing in the defence of the realm as well, right? We could get that horribly wrong and then leave Australia exposed. So it's not that, it's always wrong or right. It's just we are closing off options for future generations by investing in particular things. It's about having that conversation more clearly and with a broader audience. So it was a sad baby because in this particular budget, most of the purchases that we made were for weapons. They were for long range missiles and for the beginnings of the submarines. The submarines, it's a 30-year funding process. So this budget had only a small part, but it had a huge amount of missile spend. So I think spending money on missiles equals a sad baby because it makes the world a less secure place for the baby in the future, no matter what. Even if they stay in their shed, they still have created an environment which is more destructive than it was before. But with housing, you have a different kettle of fish. So they want to build 1 million houses. When you analyse the budget, actually they're going to train a whole lot of tradies and they're going to give the state some money to do certain things, like when you actually crunch it down. And that basic budget analysis is always very rewarding. You get what's in the budget statement to the actual nitty-gritty of what is funded back to what will actually be delivered. There is some emergency housing for women fleeing domestic violence, which I think is very good. So actually, when you get to how many actual houses will be built with that money from this year's budget, not so many, right? But we say if the measures are successful and if the forward estimates are successful, we've still got a problem because it's still based on this idea of market-based stock. Still doesn't have sufficient planning or design standards to make sure those houses are resilient to climate change. So again, it's a kind of a climate lens on this housing supply. Not all housing is created equal. So if we get the wrong housing, poorly designed, in the wrong place, with a lack of infrastructure around it, then it will be worse than no housing at all. We'll be creating a different housing crisis in a 50-year period, right? So it was a really interesting exercise to say, just building houses is not good enough. It's got to be housing that is future-proofed in the right areas, not in heat sinks, not in floodplains, not in places that are going to have increased coastal hazards, insurable houses, that meet certain design standards for extreme heat and for, extreme weather. So that was the analysis of housing. So you can see how putting a future lens on the current housing crisis just gives you an extra set of things to think about and be nervous about. So we also looked at mental health. That was done by our colleagues at Origin. Again, highlight in the budget was this access to online health services, mental health services. Great, right? All of us would think that's amazing and we so desperately need. So these are for low people who aren't having a serious crisis. They need kind of lower level counselling help. And you think to yourself, well, that's great for our young people. They'll finally get access to a counsellor at least online. The analysis is really useful. It says, well, if they actually have a clinical mental health issue, which most of our kids do, then fobbing them off with a lower level counsellor online is not going to help them particularly. So it was a bit sobering in terms of are we in fact creating the workforce that is fit for purpose, and it doesn't do anything to address the root causes of why our young people have such lower mental health outcomes than we did, for example. So that's a very sobering piece of analysis. There's a couple of other, there's one about infrastructure. One of the interesting things about the way the Welsh Wellbeing of Future Generations Act has been used is to challenge road building, because road building does not benefit future generations particularly. It's usually for economic reasons. So this particular highway we were going to build through a national park, it was only going to be used by those richer Welsh people who can afford cars, and it didn't tackle the obesity crisis, it didn't promote active travel, it didn't do anything really, it didn't stack up on a future generations analysis, and so the road was not built in the end. If you look at our infrastructure spend under this budget, it's pretty much all roads, and it's mainly roads that facilitate economic outcomes, export outcomes, not population outcomes. There's a little bit for cycling, it's tiny. And if we were thinking about future generations, you'd really be flipping that spend. You'd be spending it on public transport and active travel, not on increasing cars and building a path dependency towards cars for our future. So yeah, that's another one. So there's a range of really interesting pieces in there. We had our youngest member of the team wrote about tax justice, how the stage 3 tax cuts really still aren't good enough in terms of helping young people achieve a transformative wealth distribution outcome. It's a really fascinating piece by Bella. So have a look at them, see what you think, see if you think the methodology is useful or not. See if you think we missed out on an area of policy that we really should have taken a future generations lens to. And yeah, please, I'd love to hear your feedback. So maybe in the small groups, you could take one each and have a look. They're quite short. The other thing I just wanted to briefly tell you about is we've done some basically voter sample survey, a sample of 1,000 voting age Australians from a representative sample of people, so lined up to a voting sample across the country, men, women, disability, all types of demographics, to see what they thought about future generations thinking, and in particular to judge whether they thought that our politicians and parties were thinking longer term enough. And they did not. It was a really wild outcome. We have a very high percentage, I'll put that in the chat too, over 80% who really do think we need some future generations thinking, and who would think more kindly about political parties if they did adopt long-term thinking. And they thought that politicians had the skills to make long-term decisions around education, but not around AUKUS, AI, or a range of other things. So it's a really useful survey. I'm hoping it will be useful for your work, just to have that kind of baseline data on, Australians actually would like to see a little bit of longer term vision. I think we're probably lucky at the moment. There's a bit of a moment because a lot of these cost of living issues are chickens coming home to roost from lack of long-term thinking. So maybe people are more interested in that kind of style, housing issues, tax issues, maybe a little bit more the climate issues, feeling a bit frustrated at the short-termism of our current political parties. So we got a very strong response. Yes, we have a whole piece of analysis on the future made in Australia as well, which was a happy baby. That was one of the few where there was a happy baby in the sense of it is an attempt for government to steer the economy around renewable energy and green investments. But we have some reservations, a little bit of a sad baby in there because it's still very extractive. All the critical minerals still extractive that could cause environmental damage. It's still really focused on industries that favour men transitioning from coal to this. It doesn't really prioritise the careers of women that will be impacted by the transition from fossil fuels, particularly in Queensland, where a lot of the funding is based. So generally, we saw it as at least it's an attempt of the government thinking longer term and thinking about what should be the role of government in being catalytic around driving investment in the right types of areas. So we thought that was good. So yeah, it's a really interesting, it is an interesting conversation. It's like, I found it, I analysed the aid budget for about 10 years for ACFID. So I was very used to kind of, aid budget good, aid budget bad, kind of analysis, as opposed to thinking, is this an aid budget that serves Australians 20 years into the future, which is a really interesting kind of mindset. So I will stop there and see how Di'd like to take this for, splitting people up or just asking questions, open to whatever people are interested in.
Thanks, Sue. I'll actually throw it to Meg. She's our chair today.
Thanks, Meg.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Susan. That was really, really interesting to hear how we kind of are taking inspiration from the kind of global network and some of the thinking that's happening in Wales, applying that to this context, and thinking about our future in the long term. So thank you for that. And also highlighting the amount of work that there is to do in this space. And that there is demand from the public to have our governments thinking about our future generations. So thank you.